Chapter 5 Atlantis, Mars, and the Moon. Atlantis re entered the public imagination by storm when US Senator Ignatius Donnelly published an extensive study of the subject in 1882. In Atlantis, the Antediluvian world, Donnelly draws on comparative mythology and symbolism, linguistics, history, archaeology, anthropology, botany, geology, and other fields to advance the thesis that all of Earth's great civilizations have a common origin. They were all seeded by survivors of a single prehistoric antediluvian pre-flood civilization more advanced than any culture known to what remains of recorded history. It is the Atlanteans who, in Donnelly's view, could be credited with the commonalities between pyramidal and megalithic architecture in Egypt and the Americas, the transplantation of the flora and fauna and certain crops of the Old World to the New World, as well as the nearly universal diffusion of certain symbols, above all the swastika, which appears to have been the predominant emblem of the Atlantean civilization. The first section of this chapter examines evidence for the existence of Atlantis with an emphasis on the writings of three philosophers, Plato, Rudolf Steiner, and Colin Wilson. In the context of Wilson's writings on Atlantis, a variety of empirical evidence is overviewed in support of the idea that survivors of an advanced civilization based in Antarctica went on to colonize the rest of the planet and were responsible for engineering enigmatic megalithic monuments on several continents. Contrary to what Edgar Cayce supposed, Atlantis was Antarctica, not the Bahamas basins, though currently sunken lands in the Bermuda Triangle, especially off the coast of Bimini, may feature megalithic structures that were part of the global maritime empire of Atlantis. Professor Charles Hapgood's Earth Crustal displacement theory is presented as an explanation for how Atlantis, that is, Antarctica, was drawn down into the South Polar region where it froze over. In this context, and with a view to the origins of the Nazi Party in the Atlantis Society Thule Gesellschaft, the German seizure of New Swabia, Queen Maudland, is discussed. Finally, there are claims of US military intelligence whistleblowers that Atlantean structures beneath the Antarctic ice are identical in style to megalithic monuments on the Moon and Mars. In the second section of this chapter, focused on Mars, a case is made that the Nordic time travelers initially intended to sequester themselves from terrestrial human history to the greatest extent possible, so as not to muck up the timeline that leads to their own genesis. As their initial base of operations, they chose Mars at a time when it was still a living planet, about 250 million years before the present. That date is based on the determination that a nuclear war took place on Mars at about that time. There are signatures in the atmospheric composition and geological record of Mars that match those of thermonuclear test sites on Earth. And these are centered at just the places where we also find ruins of megalithic cities built on a titanic scale. It seems that shortly after spawning a civilization on Mars, in what would be remote human prehistory from our perspective, something went terribly wrong, destroying not only this civilization, but also the biosphere of Mars. Evidence from CIA remote viewing suggests that the Martians then found themselves with no other option than to take refuge on the primordial Earth. However, this was at a time prior to the existence of the Moon, when the original biosphere of our planet and its rotational properties would not have been able to support human life. In the third and final section of the chapter, based on various types of high-precision data that NASA itself has amassed about the Moon, it is argued that this object is an artificial satellite. As a mostly hollow sphere, it may have served as an ark for the fugitive Martians, but its main purpose was as a terraforming device that dramatically altered the matrix of life on Earth after wiping the slate clean in the Permian-Triassic extinction event. Close encounters on the Moon suggest that it has, to this day, remained a base of operations for the Nordic time travelers. They also maintain a smaller presence in underground bases beneath their ruined cities on Mars. With the Moon as its principal headquarters, the Nordic breakaway civilization has attempted to force a hyperdimensional society on Earth. One reason why the high-precision megalithic ruins in places that have been considered colonies of Atlantis are so featureless and anonymously austere in their titanic geometric perfection is that they reflect a cast of mind that is trying to build outside of linear time. The governing class of the breakaway civilization, who consider themselves to be our gods, have convinced themselves that they have achieved perfection. They see their world as the necessary culmination of human psychobiological and social evolution. This is reflected in their aesthetics, which is absolutely totalitarian in the way that it precludes any further development by branding deviations from its architectonic as nothing more than degeneracy or decadence. In the next chapter, we shall see that there is also another psychological interpretation for this aesthetic. The two are not at all mutually exclusive, but complement one another. 5.1 Atlantis as Antarctica and Atlanteans as Engineers. In his Timaeus and Critias dialogues, Plato recounts a lost civilization that flourished 9,000 years before his time, or 12,500 years before our present. Plato lays emphasis on the fact that this is not a tall tale. He claims to have grown up with a manuscript about Atlantis in his household, a text written by Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, who was also related to Plato. Solon in turn wrote his account based on what he was told by priests of the temple of Neith during one of his visits to ancient Egypt. According to Plato, Solon had intended to replace Homeric mythology with a new mythos revolving around Atlantis and its war with Antediluvian Athens and other city-states that the Atlanteans attempted to incorporate into their vast maritime empire. Plato describes the population of Atlantis as having been created through a hybridization of gods and mortals. He explains that at the beginning of time, the gods divided the earth into distinct regions. Each region was the property of one god or goddess, who ruled over these areas either directly or via designated proxies. For example, Athens was the domain of the goddess Athena. Atlantis comes from the name of the titan Atlas, the brother of Prometheus. It means realm of Atlas. Plato claims that this was actually the domain of Poseidon, but that it came to be known by the name of its king, Atlas, rather than Poseidia, because the Atlanteans ultimately revolted against the Olympian gods. Over time, the percentage of divine blood in the Atlantean population decreased as compared to the blood of the mortals with which the pure-blood Olympians had interbred to produce this hybrid race of giants and heroes. Together with this comes a Promethean humanism that, to the mind of traditionalist Greeks, was hubris. The Atlanteans became self-confident and defiant with regard to the Olympians, refusing to obediently worship them any longer. Instead, these giants set their sights on the conquest of the entire earth through a naval dominance over the oceans and seas. Shifting from out of Solon's traditional perspective, and perhaps even from out of Plato's, and into a more humanistic mindset, we would imagine that the Atlanteans saw this campaign not as a war of conquest, but as a liberation struggle waged against the Olympian gods and the goddesses who were tyrannically ruling Earth. The rebel Atlanteans were aspiring to unify all of humanity into a world order that no longer revered the gods. As we shall see in the next chapter, this aim is not abandoned, and subsequent attempts were made to achieve it. However, the first such attempt in Atlantis itself meets with a severe retaliation from Zeus, whose pastimes include making men miserable for no good reason and shape-shifting to serially rape various mortal women. The tyrannical and sadistic godfather calls together an assembly of the Olympians and decrees that he has decided to wipe the earth clean with global deluge. This choice of punishment would seem to suggest that the Atlanteans had gotten so far with their attempt to instigate a humanity-wide revolt against Olympus that no part of the planet was considered worth saving on account of being uncorrupted by their Promethean hubris. Plato was the first philosopher to concern himself with Atlantis, but he was not the last. The Austrian philosopher and occultist Rudolf Steiner would often enter into clairvoyant trances and, like Edgar Cayce, whose remarks on Atlantean technology were noted at the end of the last chapter, Steiner also remote-viewed Atlantis. Steiner describes the Atlanteans as having descended to Earth from the celestial plane. They are older than the mortal race of man and engendered it. Some of them endeavor to become teachers to this new race, but others set themselves up as gurus over humans who were prevented from developing their own potential. Steiner traced both the guru-worshipping caste society of India and the totalitarian pharaoh-worshipping cult of ancient Egypt to this Atlantean model, which evidently some survivors of the civilization were still trying to preserve in certain parts of the post-deluge world. According to Steiner, Atlantean technology would be considered magical by modern materialistic scientists. Their machines interfaced with the psyche, requiring the cultivation of abilities such as telepathy and telekinesis in order to make them function properly. In fact, this becomes the downfall of their civilization. The Atlanteans turned their minds on one another, engaging in a psychic war with catastrophic kinetic effects that mimic natural catastrophes such as massive earthquakes and attendant tsunamis. It could be that what Steiner is describing are two factions of Atlanteans, one group that are rebels against Olympus, and another group of traditionalists who are still loyal to the gods. Or he could simply be referring to the Olympians in Plato's version as just another group of Atlanteans, because both ultimately had a common celestial origin, and at least at the leadership level, the Atlanteans were in effect fallen gods in the first place. In any case, they invade one another's minds with terrifying visions and even psychokinetically engender chimerical egregores and golems to use as weapons against each other. A third philosopher, Colin Wilson, has synthesized all of the empirical research on Atlantis or some such technologically advanced civilization of global scope in remote antiquity. For example, Wilson drew from the work of Dr. Robert M. Shoch, a geologist at Boston University who has spent considerable time studying the Sphinx temples and the pyramids at Giza, as well as other putatively Egyptian structures such as the Osireion at Abydos. Shoch demonstrated that the scallops and fissures of the weathering on the body of the Sphinx is a water erosion consistent with thousands of years of heavy rainfall. The wind erosion is a more superficial layer of weathering which only took place after the Sphinx was already heavily eroded by torrential rains. It has not rained like that in Egypt since around 7000 BCE, and one would have to postulate thousands of years of such rainfall. So the Sphinx appears to far predate ancient Egyptian civilization. The reason that the head of the sculpture, which does not show any signs of water erosion, is so much smaller than it should be if it were to have been sculpted in proportion to its body, is that some pharaoh, possibly Khufu, had it recarved because its original face and head, perhaps that of a lion, was so badly damaged by water erosion. Since Shoch turned the attention of geological community toward the Sphinx in the 1990s, the Egyptian Antiquities Authority has decided to restore, the Sphinx by covering its entire body with new bricks, thereby concealing the water erosion marks and making it impossible to study them. Unfortunately for these cynical restorationists, however, it is clear that the material of the Sphinx temples of Giza came from rock that was excavated when the Sphinx was carved out of its trench. It is a mostly underground sculpture with only its back and head rising above the horizon. That makes these structures contemporaneous with the Sphinx. Interestingly, these extremely high-precision megalithic monuments are built in a somewhat different style from the most other structures in ancient Egypt. Not only are the stones larger, some weigh 200 tons, they are also locked together with great precision, sometimes in a jigsaw puzzle-style pattern that would have required multiple pre-cut blocks and an overall plan for how each stone would be interlocked with others. The joints are so tightly fit together, without mortar, that even a razor blade or a piece of paper cannot be sleeved in between them. The structures are also lacking the hieroglyphics and the pictorial carvings characteristics of ancient Egyptian buildings. Another high-precision megalithic structure built in the same hauntingly anonymous and almost brutalist style is the Osireion at Abydos. The austerely unadorned rectangular pillars here are single stone slabs, 25 feet in height. They are on a rectangular stone island surrounded by a waterway or pool, itself set aside inside another perfectly rectangular stone enclosure. By the time of the ancient Egyptians, this was already a subterranean building, since they connected it to the nearby temple of Seti I by an underground passageway. But no one could have built a structure like this underground. How it could even have been built at all boggles the mind. Geological study of the Osireion site at Abydos suggests that the megalithic buildings are constructed at ground level and then buried by at least 8,000 years of sedimentation. As in the case of the Sphinx temples, nothing whatsoever identifies this building as Egyptian. The only marking on it is a strange geometrical symbol that has since come to be known as the flower of life, a symbol that does not appear in ancient Egyptian iconography. The ancient Egyptians themselves said that the god Osiris lived here in pre-dynastic and prehistoric times, hence the building's name. For that matter, there is nothing that really identifies the Great Pyramids of Giza as Egyptian either. The one ink cartouche of Khufu in the largest of the three pyramids is graffiti on a level with that of the many European explorers who signed their names here. Megalomaniacal pharaohs who built buildings on this scale always carve their names into the structures, sometimes multiple times, and usually in the context of long hieroglyphic inscriptions wherein they brag about their accomplishments. That Khufu would have put nothing more than an ink signature inside a structure that represents the most titanic engineering feat in all of ancient Egypt, or on planet Earth for that matter, is absolutely absurd. Unless he did not build it. Khufu's respect for the existing structure, probably attributed to the gods, would also explain why he did not have the stone walls of his chambers covered in hieroglyphics. Khufu and other pharaohs probably realized that this would have been desecrating graffiti. The three pyramids of Giza are perfectly aligned to the cardinal directions, and two of the pyramids are also precisely aligned with each other. The third pyramid is offset from the other two to a degree that reveals what the three buildings are supposed to represent, a reflection of the three stars of Orion's belt. This was discovered by the Belgian engineer Robert Bouwel. It turns out that the three stars of Orion's belt stand in exactly the same geometrical relationship to the Milky Way that the three Giza pyramids stand in the relation to the Nile River, a representation of Milky Way. Orion was equated with the god Osiris. Moreover, the architectural representation of the microcosm of Earth perfectly mirrors Orion and the Milky Way in the macrocosm of the heavens during a particular period in the precession of the equinoxes, 10,500 BCE. At that time, the pattern in the night sky appears to fall down onto the earth, where it is mirrored by the pyramids and the Nile. Moreover, this was the age of Leo, and it just so happens that if one traces the line of sight from the eyes of the Sphinx to the horizon and turns back the zodiacal calendar of the precession of the equinoxes to circa 10,500 BCE, the Sphinx watches the sun rise into its counterpart, the constellation of the Lion, every year at the dawn of the spring equinox. Circa 10,500 BCE or 12,500 years ago is, of course, the date that Plato gives us the destruction of Atlantis. Did surviving Atlanteans build these monuments in Egypt? The Chronicles of Manetho, the native ancient Egyptian history, very clearly states that the gods, of course, established civilized society in Egypt and that they governed a pre-pharaonic civilization during the course of which they hybridized themselves with the native population in order to produce the future ruling class of pharaonic Egypt. These hybrids are referred to as the Shemashu Hor, or followers of Horus, the sun, and were believed to have been masterful astronomers and astrologers. The ancient Egyptians viewed their civilization as a divine legacy, which is why they were so resistant to change. To them, change could only mean degeneration and deviance, of the kind that they punished Akhenaton for attempting. As they saw it, everything was declined from Zeb Tepi, or the first time, to which the pharaohs were trained to return effectively as physical time travelers when they died and entered the astral state. In Bekua Valley of Lebanon, at Baalbek, there is a platform that consists of 400-ton stones that are surmounted by three much larger stones, each weighing over 1,000 tons. First of all, from engineering standpoint, this makes no sense. The larger stones should have been dragged into position and then surmounted by the smaller stones, which are colossal in their own right. Instead, the Trilithons, as they are called, were lifted more than 40 feet into the air and placed on top of the 400-ton blocks. This would only have been done to demonstrate a superhuman engineering capability that we could not replicate even today with modern industrial cranes. As if this is not disturbing enough, the Trilithons were brought from a quarry 50 miles away. We know that because another stone of the same size and proportions has been left at this quarry. The stones of the Baalbek platform are fit so tightly together that, again, a knife's blade cannot be slipped between their joints. The local Arabs say that it was built by Nimrod before the flood. When the Romans found this extremely sturdy megalithic platform, they decided to use it as the foundation for what became the largest temple of Jupiter even built in the Roman Empire, with columns taller and walls thicker than any other Roman temple. However, a subsequent earthquake totally destroyed the Roman temple, leaving it in ruins, but it did not so much as put a crack in the Atlantean platform. The Romans were the greatest engineers of pre-modern world, and yet their records attest to the fact that they were incapable of even dragging or rolling a stone obelisk a fraction of the weight of the Trilithons at Baalbek. Some of the megalithic structures in South America are no less puzzling than the Baalbek platform, and they certainly could not have been built by the pre-Columbian civilizations to which they are attributed by conventional archaeologists. Take, for example, the walls of Sacsayhuamán. They have the appearance of fortifications fit for a war between the gods and titans. The boulders weigh up to 200 tons, are 25 feet in width and 12 feet thick. They are pre-cut with as many as dozen angles that interlock perfectly with those of the stones next to them, in a jigsaw construction that is so precise that a razor cannot be slid between the joints. Moreover, as in the case of Baalbek platform, the stones for Sacsayhuamán are quarried far away, 20 miles away in this case, and brought there by some inconceivable means by the unknown architects. Then there is the fortress of Ollantaytambo, the stones of which are the largest employed in any construction in the New World. Again, cut and fitted together with jigsaw precision and again transported from a quarry in a valley many miles away. A Polish archaeologist by the name of Arthur Posnanski studied the megalithic structures at Tiahuanacu in Bolivia for many years. These monuments include the massive stone gateway of the sun, the ruined Acapana pyramid, and the Kalasasaya temple. He came to the conclusion that the ground plan of the Kalasasaya temple was aligned to certain astronomical phenomena, such as the position of the rising sun, but that given the degree of precision with which the structure had been built, the current misalignment from these astronomical markers could not be due to engineering error. Rather, it was a deviation caused by the precession of the equinoxes. The alignments are perfect, Posnanski argued, if one postulates that Tiahuanacu was constructed sometimes between 15,000 and 12,000 years ago. Furthermore, there is a vastly ancient port near Tiahuanacu, again built in the same high-precision megalithic style. But the port of Pumapunku is built on ground that is much higher than the water level of Lake Titicaca today. It appears to have been constructed during a period when global sea level had risen precipitously. The Mayans and other pre-Columbian American civilizations all describe their civilizer gods as white people of gigantic stature. They also believe that the builder gods who laid the groundwork for their civilization would someday return to them. Quetzalcoatl, the feather serpent, also known as Kukulkan or Wotan, and Viracocha to others in Mesoamerica, was a bearded white man with red hair. The other gods and goddesses, who were his companions, also fit this description. All of them were giant in stature, which Nordic Europeans are when their height is compared to native Mayans and other indigenous to Central and South America. One of the reasons why the Spaniards were so successful in plundering and conquering these civilizations is that based on the appearance of the Spaniards and their magical technology, the native priesthoods mistook men like Cortes and his comrades for the civilizer gods who had promised to return after they fled on the boats without paddles. There was a great confrontation between the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl or Wotan and a figure named Tezcatlipoca, the lord of the smoking mirror. The former was a benevolent civilizer god who was trying to elevate the standard of living of the natives by teaching them various crafts, whereas the latter was a sadistic overlord who demanded human sacrifices. The ritual of cutting the beating hearts out of the sacrificial victims at the tops of Mayan pyramids dates back to the demands made by this deity who drove Quetzalcoatl and his Promethean comrades out of Mesoamerica. These beings fit the description of the Nordics, were they survivors of Atlantis? The terms Atlan and Tulan both appear in pre-Columbian languages. Plato describes Atlantis as an island in the world ocean, larger than Asia and Libya combined. In the geography of his time, this meant a landmass about the size of the ancient Persian Empire, comparable to the continental United States today. This continent-sized island was located out beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or the Strait of Gibraltar, somewhere in the one true ocean. Finally, Plato tells us that by traversing over Atlantis, one can arrive at the opposite side of the world. As Rand Flemath realized, and Colin Wilson also argued, only one landmass fits all of these descriptors: Atlantis. Flemath and Wilson are developing a line of thought first proposed by Professor Charles Hapgood, a Harvard graduate who taught at a number of colleges in New England. Hapgood had become aware of certain maps from the Renaissance period, such as that of Piri Reis and Orientus Finis, which depict the ice-free contours of Antarctica. These maps also incorporate longitudinal measurements that were far more accurate than those of the period or of any period prior to the 20th century. Hapgood came to believe that these maps had been copied from older ones, preserved in places such as the Library of Alexandria, and that they had been drawn up by a very advanced civilization of mariners who had charted the entire globe at a time when much of Antarctica had not yet encased in its present ice cap, which at certain places is 2 miles thick. Ground-penetrating radar maps of Antarctica, carried out by the US Navy and by scientific and military organizations of other nations engaged in South Polar exploration, have mapped the contours of the frozen continent. As it turns out, beneath the ice, Antarctica is actually 2 islands, with one much larger than the other. The mysterious Renaissance maps captured this quite accurately, with the right contours of these islands and their relationship to one another. Furthermore, it turns out that the ice cap of Antarctica is not thickest at the current South Pole, as it should be. Rather, it is thickest on the side opposite to Queen Maud Land, the area that the Nazi Germans named New Schwabenland, New Swabia, during their 1938-39 Antarctic expedition. All of this taken all together compelled Professor Hapgood to propose a revolutionary geological theory called Earth Crustal Displacement. Albert Einstein ultimately endorsed Hapgood's theory and wrote a preface to his second book. Agreeing to this theory, over vast periods of time, the Earth becomes top-heavy due to the concentration of ice on top of the northern landmasses surrounding the North Pole. Once the stress is sufficient, it causes the Earth's crust to suddenly slip over the underlying mantle like the loose skin of an orange. Such an event would toss the oceans out of their basins and onto the continents, causing a great flood on a global scale. In those parts of the world where it was night, the stars would appear to fall from the sky. Where it was afternoon, the sun might set too quickly or rise too quickly if it was still the pre-dawn hour. There are, in fact, accounts of such an event having absolutely terrified various tribes in the various parts of the world. This myth of the time when the sky fell, or there was a derangement in the heavens, is a common and as cross culture as that of the global deluge. Hapgood's research led him to conclude that the former pole was in Hudson Bay, and that the reason for the ice age in North America was simply that the area was, at that time, the land around the old North Pole. Not incidentally, Baalbek and Tiahuanacu are at a latitude equidistant from the Hudson Bay pole, and other ancient megalithic sites seem to be aligned to this pole as well. One of the strongest supporting pieces of evidence for Hapgood's theory are the flash-frozen mammoths of Siberia. They appear to have been toppled and dragged by the waves and then frozen so suddenly that the food they had been eating remained undigested in their stomachs. Interestingly, this food is not anything that could grow in Siberia today. It could only have grown in a much more temperate climate. So it appears that Siberia was suddenly pulled up into the northern polar region from a lower latitude. At the same time, a large part of Antarctica, which had been ice-free and located at about the latitude of Argentina, was pulled several thousand miles down into the southern polar region, encasing the entire continent in ice. This formerly ice-free region of Antarctica is an area claimed by the Nazis as the New Swabia, the region where German Navy bragged about having constructed an impregnable fortress before the war's end in 1945. The same region that Admiral Byrd's Operation High Jump met with disaster, prompting him to warn the press that we had to prepare for a Third World War with enemy fighters capable of flying from pole to pole with tremendous speed. As was already noted in Chapter 3, the Nazis were obsessed with Atlantis. It bears repeating that the entire Nazi party was simply a political front set up by the Thule Society, and in Germanic mythology, Thule is equivalent to Atlantis. At least that was the view of the esoteric elite in the society and also of the SS. Heinrich Himmler set up a think tank within the SS known as the Achnen-Nerv. This is a group of globe-trotting Nazi scientists, archaeologists and explorers popularized in Steven Spielberg's Indiana Jones films. The Achnen-Nerv had 2 clearly defined and related missions. Number 1, to find traces of Atlantis, that is Thule, and thereby rediscover the Atlantean origin of the Aryan race. And number 2, to study suppressed paranormal abilities and means of their cultivation with a view to their military applications, that is, psychic warfare. As we saw in Rudolf Steiner's account of the fate of Atlantis, the Atlanteans have long been believed to be adepts of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. Certain pre-Columbian myths suggest that the magicians of the gods, were able to levitate the titanic megaliths into place at the construction sites of some of the aforementioned enigmatic monuments. As the Aknan research progressed, throughout the course of expeditions to meet with the lamas in Tibet, in the Himalayas, and to scour the Amazon jungle looking for buried structures in Brazil, the SS elite came to some conclusions that converged with those of Professor Hapgood. They decided that Atlantis, or the Germanic Ultima Thule, and the classical Hyperborea, were one and the same place. Although ancient Greek myths describe Hyperborea, the dwelling place of Apollo and the locale of Elysian Fields, as a continent-sized island beyond the ice, at the North Pole of Earth. We know that the magnetic poles of the Earth reverse over long periods of time. There is no continental island at the North Pole, but the continent-sized island of Antarctica was once at the North Pole, with a large part of it extending out beyond the polar region at a climatically habitable latitude comparable to that of Patagonia today. Again, the part of Argentina settled by the Nazis in 1945. Finally, the SS even came to believe that whereas the rest of the world suffered a global deluge, the world of Atlantis had been lost to encroaching ice. When all of this is taken into consideration, it becomes undeniable that the Germanic Antarctic expedition of 1938-39 was not only military in addition to scientific, with the intention of building a naval base in New Swabia. Rather, these were both secondary purposes as compared to the true goal of the Nazis in the part of Antarctica that had been ice-free 12,500 years ago, to find and reclaim the ruins of Atlantis. Was this actually a kind of homecoming? The closing of a temporal Ouroboros by Nordic time travelers who built Atlantis because they were obsessed with it, and who came from Atlantis because they returned to it so that they could build Atlantis and come from it? The Atlantis Society undergoes Thule Gesellschaft, indeed, the society which recruited Adolf Hitler to head his political front, the Nazi Party. In a conversation with Rauschning, the governor of Danzig, Hitler himself had something to say about the Atlantean Superman, He corrected Rauschning, who was under the impression that the Führer was only talking about a new race, that would come about by means of eugenics. "The new man is living amongst us now. He is here," Hitler exclaimed as he trembled ecstatically. "I will tell you a secret," he said to the bewildered governor. "I have seen the new man. He is intrepid and cruel. I was afraid of him." Apparently, Hitler would sometimes wake up screaming and in convulsions. When his personal physician would rush into the room, he would find the Führer looking into the corner of the room while shrieking, "It's he! It's he! He's come for me! There! Over there in the corner! He's there!" This Nordic Superman that Hitler would describe as intrepid and cruel would appear as if from out of the wall in the corner of his room at night. Was this one of the new men that the Nazis were about to create? Had Hitler been face to face with a Nordic time traveler from prehistoric Antarctica? Which of them could be considered Dr. Frankenstein, and which one is the creature? Throughout the years, there have been a number of whistleblowers who, on condition of anonymity, have discussed secret US military and intelligence operations in Antarctica. Lyndon Moulton Howe, whose work on the cattle mutilation phenomena was covered in Chapter 2, has spoken to several of these sources. One was an airman who routinely flew scientific research personnel and cargo from McMurdo Station to other locations over the Transantarctic Mountains. He claimed that silvery flying discs would often be sighted performing acrobatic maneuvers, and that they seemed to always remain within certain territorial boundaries, never crossing an invisible line that would have brought them close to Antarctic research bases on the United States and other nations. Howe also spoke to a Navy SEAL commander who in 2003 entered a black octagonal structure protruding 18 feet from out of the ice and snow, not far from McMurdo, near the Beardmore Glacier. The structure was made of a very finely polished black basalt stone. There was the outline of a door on its surface, 23 feet high and 18 feet wide, that would rapidly slide open in response to the pressure of even a single finger. Inscribed with laser precision on its door was what appeared to be a star map together with a very precisely incised 12-spoked black sun, Schwarzsonne. This was the most sacred symbol of the SS, which had been inscribed into the floor of the meeting chamber of Heinrich Himmler's roundtable nights at Wewelsburg Castle. On the other side of the door was a room that was 9 acres in size, filled with a lime green luminescence that could not be traced to any identified light fixtures or point of origin. It may have been emanating from a fine crack between the floor and the walls. Even though it was 40 degrees below zero outside, the inside temperature of the room had been regulated to about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. At the opposite end of the room from the entry door was a ramp, also megalithic and extremely fine wrought, which provided access to lower levels of other octagons, each superimposed on the other and each larger than the other, ending in a vast complex 62 acres in expanse at a depth of 2 miles beneath the Antarctic ice. The commander wandered the halls of these well-preserved buildings that were flash-frozen. Bathed in an airy green luminescence, the Navy SEAL observed strange hieroglyphics lining the walls. He said they were neither Egyptian or Mayan, but bore some resemblance to both. The Navy SEAL informed Howe that since the time that he was there, American submarines have found another subglacial entryway to the maze of massive megalithic structures in Antarctica, at a dock that takes them directly to a point 2 miles beneath the ice, without passing through the octagonal entry levels from the surface. Another source, a Marine who claimed to be involved in the Pentagon's secret space program, told Linda Moulton Howe that the exact same type of hieroglyphics that have been found inscribed on megalithic structures that are located on the dark side of the moon as well as on the structures at Cydonia in Mars. He also alleged that there are publicly undiscovered pyramids buried in Egypt near the Valley of the Kings, which feature the same type of hieroglyphics. In the next 2 sections of this chapter, we will look at Mars and the Moon. Bearing this question in mind, what conclusion would we have to draw if Atlantean architecture, of the kind that survivors of Atlantis built in Egypt, the Middle East, South America, etc., is present on the Moon and on Mars, but with evidence that these structures, at least those on Mars, were blasted into ruins hundreds of millions of years ago? 5.2 The Time Travelers Who Murdered Mars. One of the problems that any serious thinkers who invented time travel would be faced with is the danger of haphazardly interfering with human history. In particular, there would be a serious concern about threatening the conditions of possibility for one's own existence. This is the kind of problem that has commonly been framed in terms of the so-called grandfather paradox. A certain chain of events led to one society following the way that it needed in order to make the breakthrough of inventing time travel technology. The leading lights of the breakaway civilization would not want to destabilize the matrix of possibilities that actualized into the events that brought it into being. Consequently, the first thing that a time-traveling civilization would need is a safe place and time to go to, a pocket where it would be possible to isolate the breakaway civilization from the developments in the time continuum that represent its historical genesis. Of course, this continuum ultimately includes all of human history on Earth. The first place it would have occurred to such people to go to is somewhere that the Nazis had already designated as a target of their space program as soon as they began to build rockets, namely Mars. But at a time when Mars was still a living planet and had a biosphere comparable to that of the Earth. This was hundreds of millions of years ago. If one could set up a human civilization on Mars in this past epoch, then one would have so much lead time before Homo sapiens evolved on Earth that damaging the time continuum of human history on Earth is no longer a tangible concern. At this point, it is noteworthy to remark with respect to the extraterrestrial hypothesis that as soon as these humans became a multi-generational society of city dwellers on Mars, technically these Martians would have to be considered extraterrestrials if they were to return to Earth in spaceships at some later date, albeit contrary to their original intention in going to Mars to isolate themselves from the human timeline on Earth. There is empirical evidence for such a scenario actually having taken place. Dr. John Brandenburg is a plasma physicist who worked on the Clementine project for NASA and has done classified research at a number of leading US government scientific institutions, including Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratories. His initial area of specialization was magnetic containment of plasmas for the purpose of achieving nuclear fusion power. While working with NASA, he was also the first scientist to have suggested that Mars once had oceans. During the period when Brandenburg was working at Sandia Laboratories in mid-1980s, an associate office whose specialty was nuclear weapons testing engaged him in a conversation about puzzling data from atmospheric tests on Mars that Brandenburg was reviewing. NASA exploration by means of various probes has revealed that the isotopic signature of Xenon 129 is very consistent across all rocky bodies throughout the solar system. All other planets, except for the gas giants, have the same isotopic ratio of Xenon 129 in their atmosphere that Earth does, except for Mars. When the colleague looked at the data that Brandenburg was poring over, he noticed that the specific isotopic ratio of Xenon 129 in the Martian atmosphere matched, point for point, the kind of signature that one finds only at thermonuclear weapons test sites on Earth. One does not find this Xenon 129 concentration at ground zero of atomic blasts such as Trinity, Hiroshima, or Nagasaki. It requires the thermonuclear fusion of a hydrogen bomb to skew the Xenon 129 isotopic ratio from what it normally would be on Earth or any other rocky planet. Somebody nuked them, the colleague says somberly. Brandenburg was both appalled and fascinated. He pursued this lead and did his own extensive research on the correlation. Brandenburg also looked for other Martian isotopic signatures that might corroborate a connection between thermonuclear detonation and the deviation from standard Xenon 129 distribution on Mars. He found that both the isotopic ratios of thorium and potassium were also skewed from normal on Mars, and this further analysis indicated a ground zero for thermonuclear events. There were two, actually. Finally, since there is no impact crater at either site, a meteorite can be ruled out. Since a meteorite large enough to produce the kind of radiological signature at these two sites would have produced huge craters even if it had broken into two or more pieces. Instead, the data was consistent with an airburst, a tactic of nuclear warfare intended to maximize casualties by detonating a bomb at some altitude above a city so that the ground will not absorb any of the blast wave. The corroborative isotopic data also allowed Brandenburg to determine a ballpark date for the explosions, which he put at 250 million years before the present. Not incidentally, this aligns with the date of the Great Permian Extinction event on Earth. Brandenburg calculated, based on our own nuclear science and engineering as a standard, if only 2 thermonuclear bombs had been used, the casing of the 2 weapons that would have produced such isotopic signatures at these locations would each have been comparable in scale to the size and height of the Empire State Building in Manhattan. Of course, it is more likely that many thermonuclear weapons were detonated at each place to produce the observed atmospheric and elemental deviations from normal ratios of Xenon 129, thorium, and uranium. What are the 2 locations? Cydonia and Utopia. This is very significant. These are the 2 places on Mars where there appear to be blasted ruins of vastly ancient megalithic structures. Photographs of Cydonia brought back by the NASA JPL Viking orbiter in July of 1976 showed what appeared to be a colossal face near a pentagonal pyramid that has suffered partial structural collapse, as well as a number of other nearby structures that look like buildings rather than geological formations. Interestingly, when 2 of the edges of the pentagonal D and M pyramid are extended out into lines of sight across the surface of Cydonia, they point directly at the Sphinx-like face and into the heart of a cluster of buildings that some have dubbed the City Complex. Several pyramids and other anomalous polygonal structures also appeared in photographs of the Elysium and Utopia regions. Cydonia and Utopia are the ground zero sites of the nuclear isotopic signatures discovered by Brandenburg. Interestingly, when confronted about the face, NASA JPL felt the need to blatantly lie to the press. This lie says as much about what was discovered at Cydonia as the photographs do. When the image of the head, as it was labeled, was released at a NASA JPL press conference, the JPL scientists claimed that another image taken by the Viking orbiter an hour later showed that the face was a trick of light and shadow. In point of fact, Cydonia was in darkness a few hours after the first image of face was taken, and besides, JPL actually waited until 4 weeks later, 30 orbits of the orbiter, to take another image of the face at Cydonia, and it never announced the second picture had been taken. The second image, which captured the face from another angle, only made the case stronger for it being an artificially carved structure. NASA was taken to task by Richard C. Hoagland, who was a science advisor to CBS News during the Apollo program, 1968 to 1971, and who has been the recipient of the International Angstrom Medal for Excellence in Science 1993 and Ig Nobel Prize for Astronomy 1997. Hoagland recruited Vincent Di Pietro and Gregory Molinar, two image processing experts working at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, to enhance electronic versions of the frames from the Viking images of Cydonia. It is worthy of note that Hoagland had to threaten JPL with a congressional inquiry before they would release these frames to Di Pietro and Molinar. Eventually, this team of independent but government-associated experts expanded to include Dr. Brian O'Leary, a former astronaut and planetary scientist, Dr. Mark Carlotto, another image processing scientist, and John Brandenburg himself. Brandenburg discovered that the structures in Cydonia and Utopia were built near the coastline of the Paleo-Ocean of Mars, just as Earth's great cities are coastal. Carlotto enhanced the face to the point where it was possible for him to render a three-dimensional, rotatable version of it. In 1998, NASA released images of the face that were supposedly taken by the Mars surveyor and that purported to reveal that nothing was really there but some vague contours in the Martian surface. Carlotto showed that these images had been tampered with. Sure enough, the 2004 Mars Odyssey imagery of Cydonia that followed this attempted fraud once again produced an image of what clearly looks like a face staring up into the camera. The teardrop on one cheek of the Olmec-looking Sphinx can be seen more clearly in this photograph than in any of the others. Even if the structure is not a face, ensconced in a headdress, its tombstone clearly defined it as artificial rather than natural. Whatever it is, that thing is a titanic work of engineering or a natural mesa that has been expertly carved into a structure. Are there structures that date to around 250 million years before the present on Earth, which would suggest that Martians had taken refuge here after the nuclear holocaust of what had become their planet? Indeed. There is a very long and tall polished concrete wall that miners found embedded inside a strata of rock that corresponds to that geological epoch. It was discovered in 1928 by one Atlas Elmon Mathis in room 24 of coal mine number 5 in Havana, Oklahoma. After using explosives for mining purposes in that room, Mathis and his associates had found several 12-inch cubical concrete blocks that were so finely polished that all 6 sides of it could serve as mirrors. Then the room caved in, and Mathis barely escaped with his life. When he came back after the cave-in, he saw that a solid wall of these polished blocks was left exposed. Mathis continues, about 100 to 150 yards farther down our aircore, another miner struck the same wall, or one very similar. So somebody with the technology to build concrete walls that are finer than those built in the modern age was engaged in engineering on Earth around the time that Mars was nuked. There were 3 remote viewings of Mars that corroborate the photographic data brought back by Viking, and that also substantiate Brandenburg's hypothesis that a nuclear war destroyed Martian civilization. The first one was done by Ingo Swann, together with one colleague, during his work for SRI in 1975. Swann did another remote viewing of Mars in 1984, this time together with 4 other remote viewers who were independently and blindly tasked with the same target to allow for a comparative analysis of the findings. The third was also done in 1984, about a month earlier, by ace remote viewer Joe McMoneagle, working on contract for the CIA at the Monroe Institute. McMoneagle and Swann's group had no contact with one another, and each had no idea that the other was also remote viewing Mars. Ingo Swann's first remote viewing of Mars took place on June 14, 1975 at 9 p.m. EST. His colleague Harold Sherman acted as a second viewer and checked on the data that Swann obtained. Both of them saw the same things on Mars: towers, dome-like structures, and a checkerboard pattern inside of a crater, which appeared to be the roofs of buildings that gave them the impression of old Roman ruins. They said that there had been a surface-dwelling population here at one point, but it had gone underground. Swann and Sherman also got the impression that many of the structures were vastly ancient ruins, but others were newer. The most interesting of these was something like one of those towers that carry high voltage lines, which was built out of something that doesn't rust, but appeared bent, and might have been some kind of homing device like airplanes use these days when they go from one continent to the next. Swan's second remote viewing of Mars extended from June to July of 1984. They specifically targeted the area of Mars that had been photographed by the Viking orbiter, the images from which were at that time being analyzed by the team that Richard Hoagland had put together. Again, Swan's second remote viewing of Mars involved a team of 4 other remote viewers. Here is what he reports that they found. As it turned out, and with little variation, all the participants described a large crater at whose bottom were ruins of buildings, plazas, and air ventilators, which gave access to a larger underground network or complex, the whole of which gave evidence of explosions or attacks. But most strikingly, on the lip of the crater, high above the city, was a monumental pyramid-like structure whose specific purpose was difficult to ascertain save that it was hollow inside. After the combined data was submitted to Lambert Dolphin, a pseudonym for a colleague of Swan in the IC with a very high-level security clearance, we were informed that the site indeed was a suspected city within a crater, and that on the crater's rim was a strange tall structure which cast a long spiked shadow from the Martian sunshine. What Swan and his team did not know was that the CIA had done its own remote viewing of Mars about a month earlier on May 22, 1984. The CIA report of the 1984 remote viewing of Mars at the Monroe Institute has since been declassified and released. This has also allowed McMoneagle to comment on it publicly, especially in lectures delivered in the professional RV community. The following presentation of what he saw on Mars is based on both the CIA report and McMoneagle's retrospective recollection of the experience and elaboration on what he told the interviewer who was tasked with guiding him through the target to which he was blind. McMoneagle was tasked to go back to Mars 1 million BC, and the specific coordinates given were those of the Cydonia region. He reported that he saw blasted and ruined megalithic structures that were titanic in scale, engulfed in terrible sandstorm and swallowed by desert dunes. He got the impression of shadows of people who once were but who are no longer there. So the interviewer asked McMoneagle to go back further, to a time when people who had built those structures were still there. Considering the way that remote viewing works, and the fact that no specific time frame was stipulated in the initial targeting information other than 1 million BC, we have no way of knowing how far back McMoneagle went as measured in chronological time. Remote viewers do not sense scales of time as they move back and forward, sometimes almost instantaneously, across the time continuum. All we know is that McMoneagle followed the instruction to report on those people while they were still living on Mars. There is no reason why he could not have gone back 250 million years, as Brandon Buck's analysis would suggest. McMoneagle saw a massive high-precision megalithic city. There were towering pyramids and other polygonal buildings, long paved avenues and obelisks. Most intriguing is his description of a network of intersecting channels cut deeply into the surface of Mars, with paved roads at the bottom of them. Was this a highway system for some kind of hover vehicles that would be shielded from the storms on the surface by these trenches? He noticed that the sun was weird looking, which to a Terran eye it would be, since Mars is further from the sun than Earth. Interestingly, not knowing that he was tasked to view Mars 1 million before present, McMoneagle kept getting the impression that he might be in ancient Egypt, except for the fact that the scale of the structure was too large and the people there did not look like Egyptians. The people were European looking in phenotype, but very tall and lanky. They wore what he described as skin-tight silken clothes. McMoneagle had 3 psychic impressions about these people that are very relevant to the thesis being advanced in the present study. First, he said that he kept having the impression that he was looking at the future, and that these people represented some further evolutionary stage of humanity, as if, we mutated 6 times over the next 10,000 years. Interviewer: and this concept that you have that you went somewhere into the future, that these people exist somewhere in the future, how does that parallel with what you just said about this difficult concept that they are one step removed from our reality? McMoneagle got the impression that these people were one reality removed from our world. And again, this is a totally inappropriate way to say it. This is like a reality one step removed from a reality. that doesn't mean it is a different reality, but that it is one step removed for some reason. It's still a part of this reality, but it is still one reality removed. What I'm saying is, damn it, I can't apply our reality to it. This impression is, of course, perfectly consistent with the idea that the Martians, of course, were actually distant descendants of breakaway civilization time travelers. The impression that put McMoneagle, who is not a scientist or a philosopher, at a loss for words, namely that these people from the future, of course, are one step removed from our reality, of course, is him picking up on the fact that if, from his perspective in 1984, these would-be Martians had not yet time traveled back to Mars millions of years in the past, they may not exist in our version of reality. Alternatively, it could be that even if their progenitors had already traveled into the Martian past and set up that civilization, which then faced its destruction, certain events have occurred subsequent to the initial time travel that have put their timeline and the very existence of their Martian civilization in question. They have become ghostly and their civilization might disappear altogether, like the history of South Africa after Nelson Mandela's first death in prison. From McMoneagle's perspective, he would have the psychic impression that such people were from the future, because the breakaway civilization probably did not begin time traveling on a significant scale until the late 20th or early 21st century, and then they would have had centuries of further civilizational development on Mars. Even if this development took place hundreds of millions of years ago, within the frame of chronological time, this is not something that McMoneagle would necessarily have picked up on psychically. He was tasked to read the minds of these people, to know what they know, and to them, the world that they are living in is that of the far future of man. One has to imagine a timeline of future civilizational development that jumps from the secret developments in the 1990s and the early 21st century, which would already be the future, of course, from McMoneagle's perspective, to thousands of years further into the future history of these people, but on Mars in the chronological past. The second noteworthy impression that McMoneagle had is that he said that the Martians were very philosophical, of course, about the fact that their time had passed, of course, and almost stoically resigned to the prospect that they may be facing the end of their civilization, almost as if it was not their right to have any more time than they have had. Third, McMoneagle said that they had been looking for a way out, of course, and no matter what they tried, they just can't seem to find a way out, of course. Now, this third impression cannot be referring to finding a way to get off the planet, because McMoneagle clearly described how the Martians had indeed constructed a spacecraft and had sent one of these to go scout out another world as a possible place of refuge for their civilization. He described the scout craft in terms that perfectly matched a metallic cigar-shaped UFO. The people back on Mars were holed up in large storm shelters, just waiting for this scout ship to come back with word on whether the other place was suitable for mass relocation and colonization. The terrible storms were a consequence of some catastrophe that had taken place, which was responsible for the destruction of the Martian ecosystem. So I suspect that the fact that they could not find a way out, of course, refers to the humans on Mars not being able to leave the solar system and relocate to a habitable planet around another star. We will return to examine why this might be the case in Chapter 7. In short, I think it is because the time travelers who had just nuked an entire planet to death were being quarantined. Some of them were trying to accept this, namely that by becoming time travelers to the past, they had already bought their people more time than they were supposed to have, while others were still trying to hang on the course and were willing to interfere in the timeline of Earth and the past of their own progenitors in order to further extend the lifespan of their civilization. The CIA interviewer at Monroe Institute asked McMoneagle to describe where the scout ship journeyed to. The cylindrical spaceship arrived at a planet that, unlike the dying Mars, was full of vegetation, actually overgrown with monstrously huge trees and plants. McMoneagle described how there were also storms on this planet, but storms of a different kind, like constant hurricanes or typhoons conjured by the seething oceans and shot through with perpetual lightning. Volcanic eruptions also seemed to be frequent occurrences that contributed to the sense that if the Martians were to take refuge here, they would be going from the frying pan into the fire, of course. I suspect that what McMoneagle was seeing was scouts from Mars arriving at the Earth at a time when the moon did not yet exist. 5.3 Manufacturing the Moon or Terraforming Space Station. We only have seasons on Earth because of the 23-degree divergence of the celestial equator. The equator extended into space, and the ecliptic, the plane of Earth's orbit around the Sun. If it were not for this misalignment, our equator would always be facing the Sun, which would make for a planet that would, for humans, be unbearably hot at the equatorial latitudes and much colder toward the poles. For example, although Mercury, which has its ecliptic aligned with its celestial equator, has an equatorial temperature that makes metals boil, its poles are frozen over the ice. On account of the tilt in the Earth's axis, instead of hitting on the Earth as a perfect circle, the Sun's light was warped into an oval that spreads heat over a large area at a lesser intensity. Here is Christopher Knight's description of what conditions on Earth would be like were it not for the 23 degree of divergence, which were caused by the gravitational pull of the moon. Life would be almost impossible across most of the planet, with extremes of temperature providing only a narrow band suitable for mammals such as humans to survive. Even then, the sea and air currents would move wildly between the hot and cold zones, causing catastrophic weather conditions with regions of permanent rainfall and others with none at all. Hurricanes and tornadoes would ravage many areas, and overall it seems extremely unlikely that higher forms would ever develop on such a planet. This sounds an awful lot like Joe McMoneagle's description of the conditions that the Martians discovered on Earth when their scout ship first arrived here. According to Jacques Lasca, an astronomer who is Director of Research at the National Scientific Research Center CNRS of France, the moon is also a stabilizer that prevents the Earth from toppling over the way that Venus and other planets have throughout the history of the solar system. His computer models show that all of the other Earth-like planets in the solar system, such as Mercury, Venus, and Mars, have had slightly unstable obliquity. In the case of Mars, this has varied from 0 to 60 degrees. Lascar showed how, without the moon, Earth's obliquity would be even more extreme, with a shifting of planetary axis between 0 and 85 degrees from its current position. Each sun toppling would wipe the planet clean of all higher life forms. Furthermore, the moon has slowed the Earth's rate of spin, without which humans could never have inhabited its surface, even if we evolved elsewhere. Neil F. Cummins, professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Maine, explains that without the moon, the Earth would be turning so fast that a day would take just 8 hours, and complex life would never exist yet. If higher life forms did eventually manage to evolve, such creatures would be very different from us. For example, they would be without any communication through speech. Measurement of the oxygen isotopes of many moon rocks prove that they originated at the same distance from the Sun as the Earth. However, other moon rocks are 4.5 billion years old, about a billion years older than any rock ever studied on Earth. This means that the artificial spherical structure was astroturfed after it was positioned in orbit around the Earth, and that both material from the Earth and from some older planetary body was employed in surfacing it. The Steiner theory of the formation of the moon is that it was created in the collision of a large planetoid, or a small wandering Earth, with the Earth. William K. Hartman proposed this big whack theory in his 1986 book, Origin of the Moon, agreeing to which the moon is the product of a collision between Earth and other planetary body about the size of Mars, with the matter ejected from the mantles of both bodies cohering in orbit around the Earth to produce the moon. This theory had the virtue of attempting to explain how only some of the matter on the moon is similar to that of the Earth while other elements are alien in their composition. If such a big whack had formed the moon, the surface of the moon would contain significant amounts of iron, but analysis has demonstrated that it does not. The primordial Earth was covered in iron that took billions of years to sink down from the mantle to the core. In fact, the moon is lacking heavy metals in general. A review of a few sets of astonishing numbers suffices to demonstrate how preposterous such a theory actually is. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun and is also 1/400th the distance between the Earth and the sun. A predictive understanding of eclipses, not just awesome total solar eclipses, but also lunar eclipses, wherein the moon turns an eerie blood red, gave ancient priests and their associated kings an aura of supernatural power and authority. But hardly anyone stops to think about how unlikely a phenomenon such as a total solar eclipse would be if the moon had formed naturally or been captured randomly by the Earth. Although one side of it always faces away from us, as the moon rotates around the Earth in its interlocked orbit, it covers 400 km per Earth day, precisely 100 times less than the Earth's 40,000 km per day. The moon's orbit around Earth takes 27.322 days, and the moon is 27.322% of the size of the Earth. Multiplying the circumference of the moon by that of the Earth gives you a figure of 436,669,140 kilometers. Dividing this by 100 yields 436,669 kilometers, a figure that matches the circumference of the Sun to within 99.9%. The moon's movements over the course of the year have a precisely inverse correlation with those of the Sun, so that when the Sun is at its weakest and lowest point at the winter solstice, the moon is brightest and at its highest point in the sky, whereas when the moon is at its weakest point, the Sun reaches its highest and brightest point at the summer solstice. The Sun and Moon have the same settling point on the horizon at the fall and spring equinoxes, September 21 and March 21, but they set at the opposite points on the horizon at the solstices in June and December. In November of 1969, the crew of Apollo 12 sent their lander crashing into the lunar surface before starting on their return to Earth aboard the command module. The impact, equivalent in magnitude to 1 ton of TNT, caused reverberations in the moon for nearly an hour. However, the shock wave built up to peak in only 8 minutes. This is the kind of signature one sees when a hollow metallic object is struck. Ken Johnson of Northrop, who was at NASA's Lunar Receiving Laboratory, said that in addition to ringing like a bell, this impact made the entire structure of the moon wobble, almost as though it had gigantic hydraulic damper struts inside it. On April 14, 1970, at 8:09 p.m., the third stage of the Saturn V launch vehicle of Apollo 13, which weighed 15 tons, crashed into the moon. The impact site was 85 miles west-northwest of the seismometer that had been repositioned by Apollo 12. The impact had the magnitude of 11.5 tons of TNT. It made the moon ring for 3 hours. According to Dr. C.N.C. Solomon, professor of geophysics at MIT and director of terrestrial magnetism department at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, as well as the principal investigator for Carnegie's joint research with the NASA Astrobiology Institute, the lunar orbiter experiments vastly improved our knowledge of the moon's gravitational field, indicating the frightening possibility that the moon may be hollow. Why would this be frightening? Because, as Carl Sagan once explained, back when he was professor of astronomy and space sciences and director of the Laboratory for Planetary Studies at Cornell University, it is well understood that a natural satellite cannot be a hollow object. Already in 1962, Dr. Gordon MacDonald of NASA had published a paper in the Astronautics magazine wherein he argued that characteristics of the moon's motion gave him reason to believe that it was hollow. Two senior members of the Soviet Academy of Sciences were the first scientists to seriously propose that the moon is a hollow, artificially constructed satellite that was steered into orbit. Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov proposed this in a paper titled "Is the Moon the Creation of Intelligence?", which was published in the periodical Sputnik. They write, "If you are going to launch an artificial Sputnik satellite, then it is advisable to make it hollow. Probably the shell is a double-layered affair. The base is a dense armoring of about 20 miles in thickness, and outside it some kind of more loosely packed covering, a thinner layer, averaging about 3 miles. In certain areas where the lunar seas, undercoats and craters are, the upper layer is quite thin, in some cases non-existent." The Lunar Prospector Magnetometer determined that the moon has a tiny metal core measuring roughly 420 miles, 680 kilometers in diameter. The radius of the moon is 1738 kilometers, that is 1080 miles. This means that if the lunar shell, including both the surface and the metallic casing, is only about 20 miles deep, the hollow space inside the moon is about 1079 miles in radius in all directions from the metallic core. To put that in perspective, it is about the distance between New York and St. Louis, or between Los Angeles and Seattle, or between Paris and Prague. Of course, That does not mean that this space is uniformly hollow, but that it is an immense area for artificial constructions of various kinds. One thing that has led researchers toward the conclusion that the moon is hollow is the fact that despite how wide some lunar craters are, in some instances spanning even 100 miles in diameter, none of the lunar craters are ever more than a few miles deep, maybe 5 or 6 miles deep at most. For example, the Gagarin crater is 186 miles across, but less than 4 miles deep. Clavius, at 146 miles in diameter, could fit the entire land of Switzerland and Luxembourg within itself. But the crater goes only 3 miles down at its greatest depth. According to scientists at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, what we ought to have expected to find, taking into account the specific gravity of the moon, were craters that are tens of miles deep, depending on the size of the meteorite or asteroid that impacted to create them. Most disturbing of all is the fact that the basins of the largest lunar craters are not concave, as would be expected. They are convex. In other words, their contact lens shape seems to follow the curvature of a smooth structure beneath the moon dust that is pushed out to form the crater walls. The lunar craters are so shallow despite how wide they are, because any object impacting the moon strikes the impenetrable spherical metal casing of the space station after passing through the shock-absorbing coating that is only a few miles deep. There are huge variations in the gravity of the moon from place to place. These are called mass cons, because it's supposed that discrete concentrations of mass beneath the surface of the moon are causing these regional intensifications of gravity. The mass cons make it difficult and dangerous for a spacecraft to operate in proximity to the surface of the moon. The pilots of such craft have to keep making adjustments to compensate for these sudden shifts of gravity so that they do not crash into the lunar surface. These mass cons are perfectly circular. Could it be that they are giant saucers prepared to peel off the surface of the moon in case the satellites needs to be evacuated? Perhaps the local intensification of the gravitational field of the moon over these mass cons is on account of the fact that these saucers have their engines running, thereby producing a local gravitational field stronger than that of the rest of the moon, which might also emulate Earth's gravity for those inside of them. We have records of UFOs observed on or around the moon through telescopes which go back 2 or 3 centuries and were carried by some of the world's greatest astronomers such as Sir John Herschel and J.H. Schroeter. These include dark spots moving in various directions across the illuminated surface of the moon and bright spots moving against the background of the dark surface of a crescent or new moon. Reports of these, which were featured in some of the leading astronomical and scientific journals of the day, even included structured objects such as a triangle of light. One group of UFOs was sighted simultaneously in both Illinois and Paris on August 7, 1869. There had been a total solar eclipse, during the course of which several UFOs crossed the surface of the moon, moving in parallel to one another as if flying in formation. Professor Swift of Mattoon, Illinois, reported this in the Journal of Franklin Institute, and it was also reported in the journal Le Monde by Professor Hinz and Jane Mayer, who had witnessed it in Paris. Astronomers such as German Johann Schroeter were engaged in drawing up meticulous maps of the moon as early as 1843, and in the process of doing so, they observed through their telescopes that entire craters, such as the 6-mile wide and 1,200-foot deep Lean crater, were gradually disappearing. Today, for example, the Lean crater is nothing more than a tiny pit. The astronomer W.H. Pickering, who discovered Phoebe, the 9th satellite of Saturn, made numerous observations of traveling dark objects on course that would change their positions on the moon on a monthly basis, especially in the area of the Eratosthenes crater. On account of the pattern of movement, he assumed with late 19th century naivety that they were migrating swarms of giant insects or some other life form. No less than 434 luminous phenomena sighted on the moon were catalogued by astronomers from 1540, when the first telescopes were crafted, to 1967, the eve of the Apollo missions. These sightings are not randomly or even distributed over the whole side of the moon that faces Earth. Rather, certain areas seem to be hotspots of activity, such as the craters Plato, Aristarchus, and Timocharis. Quite a number of these form geometric patterns, such as triangles, squares, and circles. We can only imagine how many unobserved luminous phenomena there were on the dark side of the moon during this same period. The sites chosen for the lunar landers were those places on the side of the moon facing us that were least noted for lunar activity. On October 12, 1954, an astronomer using a telescope at Edinburgh Observatory tracked a dark sphere on the course traveling in a straight line from the crater Tycho to the crater Aristarchus over a period of 20 minutes, which would mean that the UFO was moving at a speed of 6,000 miles per hour. A month earlier, in September of the same year, two men using a 6-inch telescope had sighted a similar object and watched it for more than 40 minutes as it left Mare Humboldtianum and ascended into space. In February of 1967, the NASA Lunar Orbiter III photographed Sinus Medi from an altitude of 35 miles. Frame LO384M of this photo shoot reveals an object that has since been dubbed the Shard on the course, an obelisk-like structure that rises 1.5 miles above the lunar surface. Importantly, also captured in this photograph is the shadow of the Shard, stretched across the surface of the moon at exactly the angle that it should be considering where the sun was at the time. If this were somehow a freak of geology or some extremely long and narrow meteorite that just so happened to lodge itself in the surface of the moon in a perfectly vertical fashion, other meteors that are part of the moon's constant meteoric rain ought to have pulverized it by now. Sergeant Carl Wolf of the US Air Force was a specialist in photographic reconnaissance technology who had a top-secret crypto clearance while working with the Tactical Air Command at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. His routine work consisted of repairing the machines that were then used to process highly classified spy satellite and U-2 spy plane photographs of sites such as Soviet missile installations. In July of 1965, he was ordered to repair a machine at an NSA facility on Langley Air Force Base, which he mistook for a NASA installation because at that time he and the entire American public was unaware of the existence of the National Security Agency. Considering what he saw there, the confusion with NASA is very understandable. Apparently, the lunar orbiter photographs being taken in preparation for the Apollo manned missions to the moon were sent to this NSA facility before anyone else got a chance to see them. His visit was strange from the moment he walked into the facility. As I walked in, there were people from other countries, a lot of foreign people from other countries in civilian clothes, with interpreters with them, with security badges hanging around their neck. The first thing I thought to myself was, if this is NASA, what are all these foreigners doing here? And they were very quiet, very reserved, and there was a very peculiar pall hanging over them. They had a very concerned demeanor. Wolf then entered the laboratory where he was supposed to repair the equipment, at which point everyone else in the dark room cleared out, except for an airman second class, who at the time held the same rank as him. Once they were alone, this very distressed, young man could not help himself from showing Wolf photographs that were sitting there near the machinery that he was supposed to repair. These lunar orbital photographs depicted in great detail a colossal city-sized base on the dark side of the moon. Here is how he describes it in testimony entered into the record of the Disclosure Project by Dr. Stephen Greer in September of 2000. We walked over to one side of the lab and said, "By the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon." I said, "Whose?" "What do you mean, whose?" At that point I became frightened, terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room right now, I know we're in jeopardy, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. I was fascinated by it, but I also knew that he was overstepping a boundary that he shouldn't. Then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base on the moon, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. Some of the structures are half a mile in size, so they are huge structures, and they are all different sized structures in different photographs. Some of the shapes, as I said, some of the buildings were very tall, thin structures. I don't know how tall they were, but they must be very tall. They were angular shots with shadows. They were spherical and domed buildings that were very large. They stood out very clearly. They were very large objects. It's interesting because I tried to relate them in my own mind to structures here on Earth, and they don't compare to anything that you see here in scale and structure. They're similar to a degree. I tried to relate them to metal structures and I couldn't see a metal definition. They are more like a stone structure, but a fabricated stone. Some of the buildings seem to have very reflective surfaces on them. A couple of structures that I saw reminded me of cooling towers at power generating plants. They had that sort of shape. Some of them were just very straight and tall with a flat top. Some of them were round. Some of them looked like a Quonset hut with a dome like a greenhouse. The particular shot that I saw, they were several clustered together over a landscape, a fairly large landscape. There was one building that had a dish-like shape to it, but it was very large. It looked like a rare dish, but it was a building. There was another building near it with an angular top that was truncated. I didn't want to look at it any longer than that, because I felt that my life was in jeopardy. Do you understand what I'm saying? Sergeant Wolf, whose expertise was photographic reconnaissance, says that even back in those days, he had seen satellite photographs that were so high resolution that he could read the license plate of a car in them. The resolution of these lunar orbiter photographs of the city on the dark side of the moon reminded him of those types of photographs in their level of detail, and he had repeatedly wondered throughout the years why NASA photographs of the moon, or at least those released to the public, are so low resolution by comparison. These high-resolution images of the dark side of the moon seem to have been in the possession of a highly classified program that enlisted remote viewers to take a closer look at the structures in the photographs. In February of 1975, Ingo Swann was contracted by a certain Mr. Axelrod on the course, who brought him to a remote viewing program that was even more highly classified than the one that he had been working with at SRI with funding from the CIA. At that undisclosed subterranean location, where he was flown by helicopter while blindfolded, before descending deep underground in an elevator, Swann was tasked with remote viewing the moon. At first he was not told what the target was, but after describing many structures, objects, and even people that were part of a civilization located there, his handlers admitted that they were using him and other psychics as an aid in the interpretation of photographic data that they had amassed. Apparently the Russians had started to do the same, and the Americans did not want there to be a psychic gap on the course in the superpower race to understand what and who was on the moon. Swann saw geometrically shaped buildings of various sizes, many of them domed. Some of these domes were surmounted by large platforms that were cross-shaped. There were also obelisks, like the Washington Monument, which he said appeared to have no function. In other words, he got the impression that they were decorative or purely monumental. Swann described many items relevant to mining operations. These included huge stadium-sized floodlights set up on metal rigs inside craters, which would produce a hazy greenish glow. Trademarks from very large tractors were observed imprinted in the moon dust. Swann even witnessed the actual mining of a mountainside by a group of men who appeared to be stark naked slave laborers. He saw net-like structures over certain craters that turned them into houses on the course where these unfortunates lived. There were very large tube-like things on the course near machinery tractor-like things going up and down the hills. The most impressive of the structures described by Swann was a tower that he compared to the height of the Secretariat building of the United States in New York, which is 39 stories high. The lunar landscape was crisscrossed by straight roads that extended for miles. There were also numerous bridges, one of which was very large but reached out without landing anywhere. Perhaps it was some kind of service plank for a spacecraft. After all, Swann saw numerous saucer-shaped vehicles featuring porthole windows parked on the sides of craters and stored inside caves or in what looked like air-filled hangars on the course. Axelrod also took Swann to a lake in Alaska where, during a nighttime stakeout, the two of them were able to observe a large diamond-shaped UFO draw up a very large amount of water from the lake. Presumably the connection is that this craft was supplying the moon. On their flight to the moon, Buzz Aldrin and others in the crew of Apollo 11 report that they were trailed by a UFO that, depending on the angle it was viewed from, appeared to morph from a cylinder to an open book type L-shaped. Frame AS1032-4822 of photographs taken by Apollo 10 captured an object shaped like this, sitting on the surface of the moon. As they approached the moon, there was very strange radio interference, with beeps, buzzes, whistles, and fire engine sirens that seemed to be more regular and meaningful than static interference. to the point where Mission Control asked, "You sure you don't have anybody else up there with you?" Someone else at ground control remarked that the astronauts must be talking to somebody strange now, on the course. In July of 1969, as revealed in the original on-airbrushed version of NASA photo number 16-919238, Apollo 11 photographed a very large cigar-shaped UFO that was glowing white and casting a shadow on the lunar surface. After having worked as a radar and communication systems engineer for Orion Electronics in the late 1950s, NASA hired Maurice Chatelain to design and build the Apollo communication and data processing system. The man has 11 patents to his name, including for an automatic radar landing system used in Ranger and Surveyor moon flights. Chatelain claimed that certain sources with their own VHF receiving facilities that bypassed NASA broadcast outlets claimed there was a portion of Earth-Moon dialogue that was quickly cut off by the NASA monitoring staff. It was presumably when the two moonwalkers, Aldrin and Armstrong, were making the round some distance from the LEM that Armstrong clasped Aldrin's arm excitedly and exclaimed, "What was it? What the hell was it? That's all I wanted to know." At this point, Mission Control asked, "What's there? Malfunction. Mission Control calling 11. Mission Control calling Apollo 11." And the astronauts responded, "These babies were huge, sir. Enormous. Oh, God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecraft out there, lined up on the far side of the crater edge. They're on the moon watching us." The Apollo astronauts were subjected to extensive hypnosis sessions wherein they were made to forget their actual experiences on the moon. Most of the Apollo astronauts become very disturbed when asked probing questions that require detailed recollection of what they experienced beyond what they are supposed to remember of their designated tasks. This was true even of Edgar Mitchell, who had a block so strong that it could not be removed by hypnotic regression. On Friday, November 14, 1969, observatories in Europe began reporting that their telescopes sighted two bright flashing unknown objects apparently following the NASA spacecraft. The next day, Saturday, November 15, the crew of Apollo 11 sent this message to Mission Control. "We have had an object which is in the same place all the time and appears to be tumbling. We have had it with us ever since yesterday, and it just seems to be tagging along with us. It's usually out our center hatch window when our roll angle is about 35. Maybe that will give you a clue and somebody can figure out what we are really looking at." According to Ken Johnston of Northrop and NASA's Lunar Receiving Laboratory, who was the first person to receive images back from the moon before they underwent any processing, Apollo 14 photographed a cluster of UFOs in a crater on the dark side of the moon. After showing these images to his superiors with considerable excitement, he found that on a subsequent re-examination of the film, the frames in question were missing. He was then ordered to destroy all the negatives of the photographs taken on this mission and all other missions during his tenure at the LRL. Yes, NASA actually destroyed the original negatives of their Apollo mission photographs. Why in the world would this be done to such historic documentation? Obviously, so that altered copies of the photographs could not be compared against the ones redeveloped from the original negatives. When Apollo 15 landed its Falcon module in a crater situated next to Mount Hadley, which rises up to 10 times the height of Empire State Building, they reported this. "When we were coming about 30 or 40 feet out, there were a lot of objects, white things, flying by the lunar module." During Apollo 17, which carried Harrison Smith to the moon, the astronauts reported seeing a UFO inside Oriental crater, at which point they were instructed to change radio communication frequencies to a more secure channel. Astronaut Ron Evans saw two UFOs on this mission, and Harrison Smith saw one. Moreover, they were explicitly instructed to photograph this UFO and did so at close range, but NASA has never released these images to the public. Apollo 18, 19 and 20 were already built at considerable expense when Apollo 17 became the last American aircraft to land on the moon in December of 1972. Why were they left to rust instead of being used? The answer is by now obvious. It was not just the UFO seen on the moon, but the fact that NASA had discovered that the moon is a hollow, artificially constructed space station. The Russians, who were apprised of the same information at the highest level of their intelligence apparatus, consequently also decided to scrap their plans for manned lunar exploration and colonization. China is about to embark on manned exploration of the moon and Mars. The Chinese are not about to allow themselves to be humiliated on the moon. Nothing is worse than humiliation from the perspective of Chinese culture. The Chinese are also one of the highest IQ populations of the planet. Furthermore, on March 10, 2021, Russia announced that it will be collaborating with China to build a joint Russo-Chinese space station around the moon. Ironically, this would in effect be a space station orbiting a space station. It is from this space station that Chinese astronauts and Russian cosmonauts will descend to the surface of the moon. Russian intelligence closely monitored what the United States encountered on the moon before deciding to abandon its own attempt at manned lunar missions. This level of Russian cooperation with China, not just in space but specifically regarding manned exploration of the moon, means that Russia has handed over its dossier of Apollo encounter and its lunar orbiter photography of the ancestor city on the dark side of the moon to China. It is no coincidence that China sent its first unmanned lunar rover to land on the dark side of the moon and planted the Chinese flag there. Given its Confucian worldview, China would never have the audacity to attempt manned lunar exploration beginning in 2025 unless the Chinese authorities had already reached an agreement with the ancestors, that is, the time travelers of the Nordic breakaway civilization. Why would the Nordics make a deal with China? Because China is the ancestor worshipping culture par excellence. Filial piety is the fundamental value of Chinese civilization. That, together with the belief that everything older is better, and that what is traditional and handed down from the ancestors is sanctified in its own right. The deeply entrenched collectivism of traditional Chinese civilization, reinforced by the modern legacy of Maoism, will ensure that as other advanced societies unravel and collapse into violent chaos, China will endure as a beacon of stability, discipline, efficiency, and order. Unlike the Western Islamic worlds, and for that matter even Russia, which will be devastated by the collapse of the Abrahamic revealed religions after the UFOs come out into the open, the Confucian belief system that holds together Chinese society will remain intact. This brings us to the religious dimension of the close encounter phenomenon.